I just want to take a quick moment to thank the Los Angeles City Historical Society for providing this platform for me. Due to COVID, I lost my graduation and I didn't get a chance to present until now. So this is an opportunity that I'm extremely grateful for. So thank you to everybody that worked hard to put this together. Quick little slideshow and quick slide about me. My name is Anthony Peña. I'm a 2020 graduate from California State University Northridge. I graduated with an MA in history. In 2018, I graduated with my BA. I minored in political science, and my historical interests are Western United States, California, and Borderlands histories. I'm currently enrolled in a credential program, and I aspire to teach at a community college in the near future. So I get many compliments because this is a very interesting research topic, and I want to just share how I got to this topic. We were in a Western history research seminar led by Dr. Sides, and we were talking about the informal economy, and we glanced over street vendors, and I started thinking about how Los Angeles is the food truck capital of the world. And if you were to go on your phone and Google food truck capital of the world after this presentation, you will see that Los Angeles is the first thing that pops up. So I did more research, and I came across an LA Times article that talks about how LA became the best and most exciting food city. And up on top on the left corner, you can see here that there's a food truck. So they're giving credit to the street vending culture. So I also learned that up until 2018, street vending was legal. So it posed this question for me: how could this dichotomy exist? And when I refer to Los Angeles, I define it as the metropolis and not just the legal jurisdiction of the geographic city. And one of the key points that I touch on is that there's a century-long mismanagement by the city and civic leaders. And the sum of this is it creates a confusing arena for street vendors. I opened the paper by talking about a man named Alan Richardson who calls the police on his wife. And that's a bizarre story because he calls the police on his wife who's selling flowers, obviously to make money for themselves. And they own leases and city approved permits to do business on the sidewalks there in Glendale, California. So the result of this is the police come and they take over and they confiscate the flowers and use them as evidence against her, and they tell her that she needs to appear to court. Now, so why would he do this? Why would they do this, right? And the answer to that is very simple. It's that there's a very complex history in Los Angeles for street vendors. As historians, we point to the 1870s as the origin for street vending culture in Los Angeles. The great Gustavo Arellano, I used him as a great source, and he finds a newspaper in the 1870s where there's a tamalero, which is somebody that sells tamales on sidewalks. So that's the starting point for this history as of now. In the 1870s, there's transportation improvements which allow Chinese and Mexican immigrants in Los Angeles to have a market to sell foods, goods, and services. And the most successful of these vendors become the tamaleros, which are Mexican natives, descendants, and immigrants that sold tamales on sidewalks. Over time, this gradually builds up to the second era that Sarah Portnoy, who I cite in my work as well, and she dubs this era, the second era, as the tamale craze. And there's two pictures on the right, and those are tamaleros. Those are people that were selling tamales on carts. And this is important to the history of Los Angeles because the tamaleros were described as men who wore bright shirts and that sold tamales from these carts. They became a very popular tourist food, and they also became important to the urban landscape because of those bright colored shirts. People wrote songs about them, and there's travel accounts from Eastern cities that say that, hey, if you go to Los Angeles or you head out west, make sure you try tamale. This is important because it allows for a newer image for how future immigrants are viewed by future Angelinos. And this era crashes after World War II because of the automobile culture in Los Angeles. After World War II, Los Angeles makes the automobile the preferred method of transportation. And all this means and the significance for street vendors is that people are now on driving through elevated highways. They're not interacting with sidewalks anymore. On top of this, there's also the rise of the fast food culture and drive-ins. So there's new trendier foods that are kind of replacing the tamale craze. And all in this mix, there's a very small short law that passes in Los Angeles in 1926. It's an ordinance that prohibits street vending in Los Angeles, and it's also used throughout neighboring cities. And this is important because this sets the tone for future generations, and it's referred to um, by supporters and opposers. And the ordinance basically just says that you cannot sell anything on the sidewalk close to a business district. The third era picks up in 1974 and it runs through 2015. Starts when Latin American immigrants start to come to Los Angeles. There's primarily Central American and Mexican immigrants that are coming. And symbolically, what happens is there's tamale carts that are now replaced by the loncheras, which are food trucks. And there's a culture clash because after the automobile culture, there's a generation of residents and migrants that moved to Los Angeles that were unfamiliar with the street vending culture. So this led to many complaints against street vendors. And almost immediately what happens is the LA City Council unanimously votes to ban street vending in 1974. Right after that, Mayor Tom Bradley vetoes this ban. And I used an LA Times article, it's on here. This is one of many articles. Erwin Baker covered the story pretty well. And after the ban, the veto again, for the city council's vote, a lot of neighboring cities and a lot of police start to enforce the 1926 ordinance. And so this creates a very complicated arena for street vendors, and people are confused about the enforcement, the regionality, and the legality of the practice. And on the right, you'll see there's a food truck, and this is in Broadway in Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles, where it is illegal, but you see it there. And that's why it's so complicated. And so what Alan Richardson was doing was trying to see what was going to happen to him and what was going to happen in the future to his street vending business selling flowers. That's what happened to in that story. Street vending is becoming more and more popular throughout the 70s and coming into the early 80s. And so support starts to grow in Los Angeles for street vendors. There's residents and urban planners that value the vibrancy that it adds. A lot of people believe that it adds color, it adds a service for many people. And more importantly, a lot of people believe that there should be economic opportunities for these immigrants. Olvera Street Church also becomes a sanctuary zone for these street vendors. One of the more important groups that supported the street vendors were immigrants of similar backgrounds. And the reason why is because they enjoy their foods, goods, and services, because it was like home away from home on a sidewalk, right? So, and the way that they expressed their support was signing petitions and showing up for them in city council meetings, and also doing protests throughout the 90s and the 2000s. The 1926 ordinance also provided support for street vendors because it was used, the interpretation was used by judges saying that it was too vague, and that if you park next to an apartment complex, that doesn't mean it's a business district, okay? So they were saying that if you're a truck on wheels, you are not a business district, you're just doing business by an apartment complex. So that was very beneficial to them. One of the leading civic leaders was Councilman Michael Wu. Michael Wu was instrumental in pushing the narrative that they should fully legalize street vending in Los Angeles. He believed that cities like New York and cities like San Francisco they had thriving street vending cultures, and Los Angeles did too, but in Los Angeles, it was illegal, and they had the harshest and most unreasonable laws against street vendors. And at the time, many believed that Michael Wu's ideas were radical, but he did set the tone for what was to come about conversations in civic meetings about the legality and legalizing street vending. There were also police officers that did not enforce anti-street vending laws. The reason why they didn't do it is because some of them felt that it was unconstitutional to confiscate personal property. Some also believe that they didn't have enough resources to take everybody's things and put it somewhere else. Others believe that it was a waste of their time and they should be allocating time and resources to fight other crimes. Now, the list of opposers in comparison to people that were supporting is a little bit longer. And business owners were almost usually at the forefront against street vendors. They believe that street vendors held unfair business advantages because they did not pay taxes and because sometimes they did not, they stole their businesses, you know, they stole their customers. There was harmonious times when business owners and street vendors had been mutually beneficial relationships where they brought a clientele and eyes to each other. But as soon as somebody was stealing a clientele in the eyes of business owners, that's when you would see many complaints rise. There was also homeowners associations throughout Los Angeles, especially in Anaheim, that felt threatened by the presence of street vendors, and they felt that the property values of their homes were going to diminish. Residents also had common complaints, and those complaints were that, especially for food vendors, that there was lots of trash. And remember, we're in an automobile culture, so there was lots of traffic, increased traffic, and some also believed that we were too accommodating here in Los Angeles to other people's cultures, and we were bringing in third world country practices by allowing street vending. And there was also health hazards, crime, and noise that were complaints as well. The 1926 ordinance was used as a precedent, and when the vagueness of the law worked in favor for vendors, residents put pressure on city council members to make sure that they can draft more restrictive and more specific laws to severely restrict or ban altogether street vending. And the police was also used to try to stop street vending in Los Angeles. They set up task force and citywide sweeps in the 1980s. And to the right, you'll see some newspaper headlines about how street vending was presented in the media and how they covered the stories. So you'll see in Anaheim, this first one here, street vending is banned. In Carson, the same thing with ice cream vending trucks. And then this article to the bottom left is from Linwood, California. And then there's also another one here in Pacoima from the San Fernando Valley. So this culminates, and this is the heart of this research, this culminates into a flashpoint in the 1980s where street vending has become like a serious offense, and it's become a highly regulated practice. And the 1982 recession and also the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act are important. The latter because it effectively prohibited the employment of undocumented immigrants. And those are influential because it kind of pushed undocumented immigrants to become street vendors. So the police and street vendors have a very unique episode throughout the 80s. What happens is they crank up a lot of resources and they increase fines and jail time. So by the 1980s, this is unprecedented because they start to confiscate goods. They give out more citations. There's now, if you're a street vendor, you can get 6 months of jail time. In 18 months, they created a task force between 1987 and 1988, and they arrested 1,200 people. And by 1990, that number doubled. The experience of vendors was that they felt that they were being harassed on racial grounds. And a woman told the LA Times that they confiscated her goods, they took her money, and they confiscated the stuff that she was selling. And many others jumped on that and started to report to local news media describing similar experiences. And in 1987, there was a 2-day sweep in southern Los Angeles that was comprised of 60 officers accompanied by health officials. And there was also this battle with that 1926 ordinance where there's further restrictions that are added on top of that original ordinance, but the ordinance is still kind of vague, so there's temporary permissions. So this is why they don't figure it out as a city, and there's no definitive law throughout the region. And when there were bans in Los Angeles, Olvera Street became a sanctuary zone for a month. The LA County Health Department, accompanied with police officers, basically invaded the private property and started giving out citations. And they started telling vendors that they now required certain health permits approved by the county. And so if you were selling toys, they needed to have certain business licenses to handle electronics. And then also if you were selling food, those vendors needed health permits and city approved licenses to do business. And the vendors' reaction to that was they said that most of them were startup businesses and they couldn't afford to meet the county's needs. So most vendors just didn't get those permits. And what the result of that is, especially for food vendors, is that it raised health concerns. There was food safety concerns and also sanitation concerns. And one other big takeaway from the 1980s is that there were, especially in comparison to other previous eras, is that there were more women becoming street vendors to make ends meet. There was also this level of expertise that they provided, and they were able to work their own schedules and all the benefits that come with running a small business per se. And to the right, you see a picture. The one on top is from 1980. It's a food truck in Venice. And it's a young boy buying food. And in the bottom from 1980, the same year, what happens is it's banned in Los Angeles, and they require, in order if you're a street vendor, the only place you're allowed to be is in the Olvera Street Church. So these are two things happening in the same year, and that's why there's so much confusion. This leads to the 1990s, and meanwhile, street vending is still becoming more and more popular, and more people are becoming street vendors themselves. So Los Angeles realizes that they cannot ban this. It's not going to go away. So they need to find a way to regulate it, and they need to find a way to compromise with vendors. Props 13 and 187 reflect an anti-immigrant sentiment. And the reason why I mention this is because it shows and sheds light and illuminates why street vendors were having such a hard time and the political climate in which they were negotiating in these meetings. So the compromise that they reach, as you can see on these LA Times headlines, is that they're going to allow vending zones. And these were failed long-term solutions because it did not serve the interest of all street vendors. If you're street vendors that did business in different cities and regions outside of these zones, they still went to their regular places, and especially those that traveled, they still nothing really changed. And this culminates into a century long of mismanagement from Los Angeles that persisted through the 2010s. And by 2014, the LA Times estimates that in just that year alone, $500 million of untaxed revenue were generated by street vendors. So in 2013, there were efforts to legalize street vending again. And these were led by civic leaders from Los Angeles that were members of Congress. And the picture on the top right shows the street vendors campaign that starts to gain a lot of attention on social media, and they start to protest, right? And Los Angeles becomes a sanctuary city. And what propelled this new modern era to the last and more current wave is the presidential nomination of Donald Trump in 2016. The election results forced, California forced Los Angeles to decriminalize street vending because they were afraid that street vendors were going to be charged with misdemeanors. They were going to have misdemeanor charges, and eventually they would be subject to deportation by the Trump administration. So the picture on the bottom right is the moment that street vendors became legal, and in my opinion, they became legitimized. So in 2018, all these years later, it's officially decriminalized.
Thank you, Anthony. Very interesting. We do have one question. Did the immigrants involved in the street vendor tradition bring the food vendor cultures from their home countries? And was the existence of an LA food culture alien to them?
Yeah. So examples of that are sort of like people from Central America would bring their cultural customs. So this becomes like a transnational kind of a development. And the reason why it starts to grow a lot is because there's more and more immigrants coming from those areas. So they have a market to sell these foods, goods, and services to those immigrants that basically. So if you're from, for example, Guatemala, and you see some Guatemalan food, you know, you're gonna. It's like home away from home, as I mentioned before. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is, by the 1970s, this automobile culture led to a bunch of people from Los Angeles that just were unfamiliar with seeing visibly street vendors. So to them, it was new, especially post-war. After World War II, there was a population boom in California and in Los Angeles as well. So those people were unfamiliar because they came from different regions of the country. So to them, it was unfamiliar.
You know, I have a question or two. When I was little, some of my older relatives would always talk about things like the Helms. They'd talk nostalgically. These were good things in their mind about like the Helms bakery truck and maybe milk delivery and stuff like that. Would those have been considered street vendors, or was that somehow different because it was a delivery service?
That's a good question. And I think that vendors at the time probably wondered the same thing, because it depended on the region and the kind of the political climate at the time. So if you were a truck on wheels, typically you would have been characterized as a street vendor. But a delivery, maybe not. I think that if you were doing deliveries, you were going place to place. You weren't. The key difference is they weren't they're not stationary.
Right.
So that would be a key difference.
I guess the vendor that I was most familiar with as a kid would be the ice cream truck. And those were always tolerated, maybe because people liked it, because it was residential. I don't know.
I'm glad you brought that up, because in the 1926 ordinance, in 1974, when LA City Council votes to ban street vending altogether, the only exception is ice cream trucks. So ice cream truck, and as long as you throw your trash away, there's no problem.
Yeah.
But I have a picture up on one of these slides. I can't see it anymore, but and I think Carson, they vote to ban the ice cream trucks too.
Right. Oh, that headline. Yeah.
Good question. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, very interesting presentation. Thank you.